Goal of this is to try and fit the Rottefella NNN-BC binding onto a Skike, originally a Skike Tour, modified by taking off all the mountings for the shoes, and instead using the Skike WAHIA binding adapters. After disassembling all the attachments that are there in the original Skike, you will see there are a couple of holes on either side on the internals, and they have a little rubber insert which you can pry out with a thin screwdriver, and you will probably need to, in order to be able to position the binding adapters freely, otherwise they'll get stuck. They're very tight inside and they'll get stuck against these inserts. In order to allow the binding adapter sufficient space to move, you may need to cut out tiny things like, for example, this label here, which will impede the binding adapter from moving further towards the wheel if needed, because it just narrows the thickness of the frame sufficiently to stop it moving there. So the way that these binding adapters attach to the Skike frame is the lower part of the binding adapter comes up to the frame from below. The upper part of the binding adapter comes down from above. They, with a bit of effort, click into place, but you still need to secure them with the provided screws in these external holes. And I suspect that all the different bindings that they're compatible with use the remaining holes here to actually fix the binding in place, with the screws provided with the binding. Now, so at first, if you look underneath here, underneath all three of the screws in which I've said you screw in the provided binding, these are screw threaded in the same way that the external holes are the two external holes are screw threaded, where which you use to secure the binding itself. I mean the binding adapter itself. In my case, the NNN-BC binding, the screws that come with that, they don't really fit the screw thread here. So I'm not really sure why that's there. I think the way it will work with NNN-BC is that these external holes are used to secure the binding in place with the screws provided. I mean secure the binding adapter in place. And then the screws provided with the NNN-BC binding screw into this binding adapter, into these holes, or this central hole, depending on where in the binding. And rather than reaching all the way down to use these screw threads, they will screw into the whatever this synthetic material is, which seems to be slightly smaller than the screws, and allow for the screws to dig themselves in the same way as they would into the wood of a ski. So that's my hypothesis anyway, and we'll see what happens once I manage to fix the binding, if it's secure. So if I use the longest screws that are provided with the NNN-BC binding, you can see that having just mounted loosely the upper part of one of these binding adapters with that longest screw, including the little metal plate, you see that it in fact the screw does not penetrate far enough to be able to, in principle, even reach the screw thread of the binding adapter corresponding to that position. So that supports my hypothesis that there's no expectation that the screw fixing the binding will actually fit into the screw thread of this lower part of the binding adapter, but instead will simply dig into the material that this upper part of the binding adapter is made from, just like it would into the laminate, whatever material the ski is itself made of. Before mounting the binding, I've just screwed all of these binding adapters into place quite loosely, just tight enough so that the screws are flush with the surface of the adapter, so that the binding will be able to move freely on top of it to position itself. But I've put them sufficiently loose so that they can all be moved to fit the binding, which of course needs to be done for NNN-BC, to adapt the rear plate to fit the length of your boot, so the rear plate slides in and out of the actual front of the binding. So next step is to put a binding on top, align the binding adapters with the relevant holes, and screw then then screw in the individual binding adapters in their positions before screwing in the binding itself, because once you screw in the binding, you will not be able to get to the binding adapter screws. Just a quick check that the heel plate is positioned at a position that is reasonable distance from the front plate for the boot size in question. So if I remove the boot, you see the binding is just completely loose on there. So once I've established the correct distance for the heel plate, you start to align the binding adapters with the binding. So to position the binding adapters correctly, I'm just taking them each in turn, starting with the rear. There might be a better way to do it, but I've just started by aligning this hole with the binding adapter to make sure that the binding fits the frame as a whole, which is quite tight for this boot size, and also making sure that the heel plate is adjusted to the correct length. Fixing this one in place, this binding adapter in place, then aligning this second hole and with making the binding adapter fit where the hole needs to be. Then once the binding adapter is in the correct position, tightening it tightly as well, and then I'll move on to the next two remaining two binding adapters afterwards. Now the binding adapters are all screwed nice and tightly into place at what I think are the right positions for the binding. By the way, you can see here where I've already tried screwing one of the binding screws into the adapter. You can see that what I was talking about is that the screw seems to have created its own thread as it bites into the material of the binding adapter in the same way that it would into the wood of a material of a ski. So that's all the screws of the binding screwed in, starting with this one, that one, these two here, which are the two longer ones, and this short one here. I guess gradually tighten these, going back and forth to make sure they're all secure as best as you can before finally inserting the flexor in the binding. Once that's all tightened up, then insert the flexor, attach the stickers, and you should find hopefully that your boot will fit nicely in place. And that should be your NNN-BC Skike ready to go.